I'm back in Chicago, but this time I'm taking Amtrak's Empire Builder for 3 days to Seattle. That'll either sound like a lot of fun or like a unique form of torture. In any case, Amtrak will lose $175 getting me across the country. That's because these long-distance trains, the ones with stake and sleeper cabins, all of them lose money. And a lot of it. A large reason why is that Amtrak hasn't been able to figure out the purpose of these routes.
A lot of people just think of Amtrak as a kind of a novelty ride, a tourist train, but this is essential transportation between these towns across Montana and North Dakota.
But how do you improve a service with such conflicting goals?
If you invest in transportation as if you're providing only for those who have no other choice, then that's what you're going to get.
This topic has been beat to death by plenty of YouTube channels that are less fun than this one. But I find that the discussion usually misses a huge part of the picture. And that's the backstory of why today's long-distance trains are the way they are. How they're less the result of careful planning and more the consequence of over a century of desperate reinvention in response to competition and regulation. So by the time we reach Seattle, we'll try and cover this incredible backstory, because I think it explains a lot of the shortcomings we see with passenger rail in America today, and therefore holds the key to turning it all around.
Do we tell these people this country can't afford this train?
Let's pick up in the 1880s, when the railroad boom was in full swing. Trains were the only way to traverse long distances somewhat reliably, and the technology was improving quickly, with things like air brakes, new signaling systems, and the widespread adoption of standard gauge. But progress on the passenger experience was less obvious. You could now reach more places for sure, but that often involved being treated like dirt. So before the Empire Builder, we're at the Illinois Railway Museum to see what these passenger trains were like, because it sets some very important context for this entire story.
The railroad experience in the late 19th century can be broadly split into two buckets: good and not good. Good meant luxury, so we have to talk about George Pullman and his iconic sleeper cars that made overnight trains somewhat bearable.
Pullman wasn't the first one to come up with the idea for a luxury sleeper, but he did revolutionize it with progressively better designs and a radical new business model.
But just like today, most people are not affluent, and for the masses, traveling by train remained pretty grim. The lowest classes of service were typically filled with immigrants and settlers heading west for opportunity on America's frontier. These trains were the opposite of Pullman's, often the oldest in the fleet, with hard wooden benches, no running water, and racism. Exact statistics are hard to come by, but we know that this group made up a significant portion of long-distance ridership at the time.
This matters, because if you have a huge number of people traveling by rail to settle on lands that can only be reached by rail, you end up really relying on railroads.
Rail dependence in the West is the easiest to conceptualize, primarily with the transcontinental railways pushing out to the American frontier.
After the Mexican War, Polk had acquired the Oregon Territory and also the Spanish territory, which was California writ large. He needed to inhabit those two regions with Americans, who at the time were defined as people living east of the Mississippi River, before the Brits could populate the Oregon Territory, and to offset the Spanish impact in the large, vast California territory. So he offered the freight rails a wonderful opportunity. The government would give the freight rails 180 million acres of property for them to push rail west all the way to the Oregon Territory and all the way into California, with one caveat: they had to carry passengers. So the deal was, you have this land, we'll support your expansion, but you have to carry passengers.
And the main way of cashing in on that land was to sell it to someone else, which meant convincing people to head west and develop land along the railway, thereby creating rail dependence from the very beginning. Of course, the transcontinentals weren't everything. Existing railroads in the east and south weren't as widely funded by land grants, nor did they necessarily create new rail-dependent settlements as obviously as they did in the west. But rail did determine the industrial and economic hierarchy of existing cities. Junction points like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Indianapolis reaped huge rewards from rail, which enabled massive industrial and economic growth thanks to better access to national markets.
The point is, by the late 19th century, railroads were truly ubiquitous. They connected every point of importance across every industry. And people weren't too thrilled about that. So with that context, let's get on the Empire Builder to see why.
This might be the most disorganized boarding process I've ever experienced.
Okay, let's go back to the video. Railroads were ubiquitous, and people weren't too happy about that. There's a few reasons why.
The far reach of railroads opened up new markets for businesses, which was especially helpful for those involved in exporting resources like timber, because demand was often highest in cities far away from where those resources were harvested.
But railroads also made life harder for local merchants, because customers could just access those faraway markets to find cheaper products, especially through mail order catalogs from companies like Sears Roebuck.
You could ship it about anything, even whole houses. Sears sold a house kit.
Huge shout out to Scott, who you'll see a lot of during this video.
My name's Scott Hurd. I'm a retired Amtrak station agent. I was with Amtrak from 1979 to 2015.
I met Scott on board, and he was kind enough to share so much of his knowledge and passion.
I'm a third generation railroader. My grandfather was the first generation of my family. That was right in 1900. He started with the Great Northern Railway. That's in honor of him today, yes.
It wasn't surprising when railroads began leveraging their hugely advantageous position. A great example of this was setting freight rates. It was sometimes cheaper to send a package from Chicago to Seattle than it was to Spokane. Apparently, it even became possible to ship something from the East Coast to Asia for less money than to Spokane. Railroads justified this by saying that competition was stronger at the ports, so rates had to be lower there, but the outcome was the same. Railroads could set whatever rates they wanted, and everyone was so dependent on them that they had no choice but to pay up. Then there was the general disregard for worker safety. Statistics from 1893 show that 1 in every 320 employees were killed every year, which is insane. And then there was straight up corruption. On top of all of this, railroads began consolidating. This was inevitable to an extent. After all, railroading is risky and capital intensive, but the US was soon left with 7 freakishly dominant companies, which gave rise to the infamous robber barons. So legislation was eventually passed, and the Interstate Commerce Commission was created in 1887. They weren't actually given that much regulatory power yet, but later on would play a huge role in the railroad downfall.
To give them credit, some railroad tycoons recognized that offering better service could actually be a good thing, partly because it would help shed some bad reputation.
So amidst all this turmoil, some railroads actually began pushing for major improvements. This coincided with a wave of technological advancements, like the introduction of steel cars that were safer, lighter, and more comfortable.
The financial panic of 1893 and subsequent consolidation of the industry also helped slow down the obsession with expansion, directing more capital towards asset improvement.
And somehow, someway, railroads had managed to usher in their golden age. They had become integral to American culture and society, allowing for the creation of national-level organizations and conventions, and even Major League Baseball. To me, this era is best embodied by some absolutely beautiful train stations in cities like St. Louis and Kansas City.
But what's most relevant for this video was the establishment of flagship name trains to compete for higher-priced passengers.
Ridership had grown steadily alongside the broader economy, but for intercity or long-distance routes, this growth primarily came from affluent tourists or business travelers, because long-distance fares were still too expensive for ordinary Americans. Prestigious name trains were therefore one way to differentiate your service in this higher-end market.
Some services focused on speed, like the Empire State Express between New York and Buffalo, that averaged over 50 miles an hour. The Express apparently even hit 112 miles an hour with the specially designed 999 locomotive. That claim is contested, though.
These prestige trains were originally clustered around high-traffic corridors in the east, but the concept soon spread west.
My grandfather, would have worked the Empire Builder. In fact, he would have worked the predecessor train to the Empire Builder, was called the Oriental Limited.
These long-distance flagships coincided with the See America First campaign, a wider push by railroads into tourism as they searched for new revenue streams. The national parks were obvious attractions to tie up with tourism-focused prestige trains, with Northern Pacific kicking things off by being smart or lucky enough to get passengers within stagecoach range of Yellowstone from its main line at Livingston, Montana. But Great Northern one-upped them.
They built the lodges in Glacier National Park. The main lodge, Lake McDonald Lodge, Prince of Wales, and then they'd have an interconnecting fleet of what they called the red buses that took people between these different resorts.
One final thing about these flagship trains was that they weren't just about market segmentation and revenue management.
Individual railroads took pride in having a flagship train. It's like having the Queen Elizabeth or Queen Mary in your fleet.
And this pride is a big reason why services like the Empire Builder still exist today. Okay, I think it's bedtime. Good morning. It was around this time, in the years leading up to World War I, that regulation and the ICC finally woke up.
The Hepburn Act of 1906 gave the ICC the authority to actually regulate things, and they immediately went after those freight rates. They essentially ended the practice of granting favorable rates to different parties in different places, and they also moved to keep rates low in general. You can almost look at this as a sort of payback for the decades of shenanigans pulled by the railroads, which was kind of true. But what's ironic is that these railroads had already begun showing signs of genuinely wanting to improve service and modernize their assets.
The regulations didn't always make sense in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. And so in many cases, they had the unintended consequence of railroads just not investing in upgrading facilities and things.
And a huge thank you to the very knowledgeable Paul Hammond from the Colorado Railway Museum. He'll help fill out a lot of the finer details of this story.
So World War I starts, and the railroad networks, it's not in great shape nationally. It wasn't carrying the traffic that needed to be carried for the war effort.
So the government didn't really have a choice but to take full control of the railroads in 1917. And long story short, it worked.
Then the question really became, gee, was this a good idea and should we keep it nationalized? Politically, you would have had to have made one heck of an argument because, basically a wartime power had been invoked in order to nationalize them.
A similar debate was playing out in Europe, and countries like France and Spain eventually followed the lead of Italy in bringing railroads under government control. The US, of course, did not end up nationalizing, but they somehow came up with the compromise of giving the ICC even more power. This turned out to be absolutely ruinous almost immediately, because the automobile was finally reliable enough to pose a credible threat, and more importantly, it was cheap enough. The broader travel market exploded as a result, but it was pretty much all from automobiles. Buses also started eating into shorter intercity routes, sometimes in the face of complacent railroad executives who couldn't believe that passengers would prefer to sit in a bus over a train. And then trucks began threatening freight as well, thanks to flexibility and being completely unregulated until 1935, so they could just undercut the minimum rates imposed on railroads by the ICC. And finally, the government turbocharged all these road-based competitors with the Federal Highway Act of 1921. Many railroads complained at the time that this was tantamount to a huge subsidy, because railroads had to maintain their own infrastructure. They didn't get much sympathy though, because it was easy to argue that railroads had already gotten their share of subsidies a century prior. But that still didn't change the difficult situation at hand.
And that mattered, because the industry was becoming more and more reliant on freight.
Major railroads like the Pennsylvania earned 4 times the revenue on freight than carrying passengers. And it gets worse, because then the Depression hit. Passenger service, which was already seen as something to be endured, became even less financially feasible for railroads as demand dried up. So 2 things happened that really shaped today's network.
Number 1, less focus was placed on short branch lines.
This was especially true for those owned by mom-and-pop railroads, and some railroads even replaced them with buses. But the second thing that happened?
In 1934, this train ran non-stop from Denver to Chicago, averaging a record-breaking 78 miles an hour and arriving just in time to open year 2 of the Chicago World's Fair, which was appropriately titled The Century of Progress.
The streamliner had arrived. The Pioneer Zephyr was nothing like the smoke-belching locomotives the public were accustomed to. It was sleek, futuristic, and took advantage of developments in diesel and stainless steel. It also represented a doubling down on the one segment where rail still undeniably held a competitive edge over buses, automobiles, and planes, and that was long-distance prestige routes.
The Pioneer Zephyr was such a hit that the CB&Q soon introduced a whole slate of Zephyr services, including this one between Chicago and Nebraska.
And what railroads see in streamliners and internal combustion, the diesel locomotive, is an opportunity to breathe some hope and revitalize railroading, give the public something to capture the imagination. They're sort of layered on top of named trains.
Streamliners were relatively successful from a financial perspective, and just to illustrate this, Great Northern even felt that the initial gains from these long-distance investments more than offset the loss in local passenger traffic.
The problem there was the other railroads wanted to put on streamlined trains, but they either didn't have the money before the war or they had to wait until the war was over to introduce them. Perhaps that's part of the irrational exuberance of what happened post-war.
Perhaps more importantly, streamliners firmly etched themselves into the social fabric of America. This would make them, and the flagship services they ran, even harder to cut later on. And why would you want to cut these services? Because World War II happened. Passenger miles rocketed from a low of 16 million in 1933 to nearly 90 million in 1944, thanks to an explosion in manufacturing, troop movements, and gas rations. Railroads were back in business, and they played a truly integral role in winning the war. The flip side was that railroad assets were run into the ground, again, for the second time in just 30 years.
And at that same time, during World War II, they pulled up a lot of steel rail for the war effort because we needed the steel.
It was worth it, because Nazis, but it left railroads in a much worse condition compared to the competition, who were now too strong to ignore. Airlines finally began pushing into the long-distance market held by railroads, but that honestly wasn't even the primary threat, because the US had massively scaled up their manufacturing base, churning out roughly half of the total materials produced for the war, across the entire world. So when the war ended, the country was left with massive overcapacity, especially in automotive plants that had been expanded and retooled to produce military vehicles.
They needed to keep that industry going, and so the effort to push the interstate and the highway program and purposefully make it easier to get a loan on a home outside the city center, and the need for families to have an automobile. And so it was a very conscious decision by the federal government.
And I'm so grateful to have John Robert Smith on to talk about this. He chaired Amtrak's board at the turn of the century, and he's currently leading multiple efforts to revitalize passenger rail across the country. We'll hear more from him later about what exactly needs to change with the current situation, and how you and I can actually make a difference. But first, back to the interstate program.
Of course, it's led to great development across this country, but the freight rail saw a rapid decline in passenger rail service because it was not invested in as the automobile was invested in.
Rising labor and equipment costs meant that by the late 1940s, some prestige routes needed twice the number of passengers to break even compared to before World War II, which was practically impossible with the increasing competition. And those ICC regulations that we've talked about so much, they continue to hamstring railroads by mandating things like larger than necessary crew sizes, and railroads still weren't allowed to just cut underperforming routes.
You had to make an application to the Interstate Commerce Commission and, justify my losses and saying, this train was losing way too much money, so we can't afford it. And sometimes they'd agree with the railroad, and sometimes they'd say, no, the public needs this service, and they'd keep it on.
Some railroads apparently even worsened service intentionally to drive away passengers and make it easier to justify line closures.
They made an effort to make the trains look worse than they were, allocating costs to the trains that shouldn't have been there, that type of thing, and downgrading service. They went from having, full service with a dining car and a lounge car to at one point even having what's called an automat car. It was a car with vending machines. Less than ethical kind of things.
The ICC eventually became a bit more lenient, partially due to the Transportation Act of 1958 that made it easier for railroads to abandon passenger service. Prestige trains held on for a while, largely due to public and ICC pressure, and because flagship services were still the pride of many railroads.
The Santa Fe was really big on that. In fact, Santa Fe kind of kept their passenger service to a certain higher standard, even though they were losing money, and bought replacement equipment in the mid-60s.
They weren't fully delusional, since the FP45 was also designed to pull freight if necessary, but this was all done in 1967.
That was the same year that the 727-200 entered service, which could connect cities in hours instead of days.
Railroads just didn't see the interstate highway network and the jet airplane all coming, and it all happened at once. And so they made their investments when it looked just right for investing in, because people were going to want to go places, and men were returning home, and families were building, and cities were building. Well, it worked for a few years, but therein is really the crux of everything, because the economic model that railroads depended on to finance long-distance passenger trains, it evaporated.
By the late 1960s, railroads were struggling yet again, and intercity passenger service alone was said to have lost $200 million in 1969.
The freights came to Congress and said, we're losing money on passengers. We want you to forgive us of our obligation to carry passengers.
So in 1970, the federal government created a quasi-private corporation that would eventually become Amtrak, and essentially let private railroads offload their passenger services to this new corporation.
And because prestige trains are one of the few segments that were maintained until the very end, Amtrak's system now features variations of iconic services like the Texas Eagle, the California Zephyr, with some hiccups, and the Empire Builder.
And keep in mind, Amtrak was created to save the national network. It was not created for the Northeast Corridor. So it was created for the long-distance system, that national system.
Of course, the creation of Amtrak didn't magically fix everything, something that John Robert knows firsthand from serving on Amtrak's board.
I came to the Amtrak Board of Directors when this country was actually spending more money per year collecting the roadkill off the nation's highways than they were spending on the entire national passenger rail system.
So I asked John Robert what has specifically held back Amtrak.
Number one, Amtrak doesn't need to be funded one appropriation cycle to the next. It needs dedicated funding that it can rely on year after year. Nationally, we've always invested just enough to allow it to limp along to the next appropriations year.
A large reason for this apathy is because Amtrak has long been expected to be profitable, even if that isn't a completely honest position to take, because any mandate of profitability was removed in 1978. With legislation since then, like the bipartisan infrastructure law, reflecting this. And on top of that, most forms of transport are simply not profitable in isolation.
When you back out of your driveway, you're on someone else's infrastructure if you're in a car. There is no conveyance that carries human beings on the face of the planet that pays for itself out of the fare box. Period. None. The Highway Trust Fund went broke in 2008, but it somehow looked at passenger rail as, oh, well, you ought to pay for yourself out of the fare box.
What makes things murkier is that most of Amtrak's losses come from long-distance services like the Empire Builder, but suggesting any form of change immediately draws public and political criticism, especially because most proposals involve getting rid of these routes. So Amtrak is locked into running services that were clearly created for a different era. Those trains then weren't allowed to evolve to deliver what was actually needed for the country. They evolved simply to survive in a car-centric world. And the effects of this are on full display when you realize just how unprepared the rest of the US rail ecosystem is.
So there is no equipment at this point ordered for any of these 69 corridors, and even if a half a dozen actually come to reality, where's the equipment coming from? And of course, you don't turn around and buy equipment down at your local passenger rail car facility. It takes 5 years or more. There's got to be a national equipment pool that Amtrak and others can acquire equipment from. That process needs to be expedited. It needs to be standardized so that we know that the equipment, when delivered, will operate on the infrastructure we have in this country. Manufacturers, Siemens, Stadler, tell me they want to build manufacturing of passenger rail cars, an industry in this country, a robust industry, but they need orders. They need reliable orders. And we believe that the language we are proposing for reauthorization will do that and deliver what the president says he wants, which is an industrial manufacturing base in the United States.
Standardization and predictable project pipelines aren't unique to long-distance passenger rail either. It's a topic that's come up time and time again in the debate on how to build cost-effective transit. And if all of this seems a bit dire, there is still hope. Again, John Robert has some input, because this year, he helped finally bring passenger rail back to the Gulf Coast for the first time since Hurricane Katrina.
When the aspirational goal after Katrina was to restore passenger rail, there was not a national framework that could allow that to happen. We had to create the CRISI grant, then we had to create the Restoration and Enhancement grant. Then under IIJA, we worked to create the Corridor Identification and Development Program so that the efforts of developing this new corridor on the Gulf could be replicated across the country. You can create national policy while working on a relatively short distance. So it's not an earmark, it's not parochial, it is expansive.
I think it's clear that some sort of top-down coordination is necessary to create any effective system on a national level, rail or otherwise. And it's always helpful to look at what other countries have done. But just keep in mind that the US is a vast and diverse place. You can make the argument that coming up with a national rail plan for the US is less like coming up with one for France and more like creating something for the entire European Union. So with that, let's finally see how you and I can actually help improve passenger rail.
A lot of times, these kinds of investments don't happen unless your government officials know that this is actually something that the public wants.
Ryan is part of All Aboard Ohio, an advocacy group working to restore intercity passenger rail, and they've got a clear strategy for how to do that.
This is just as much an education thing as anything else. When you think about a lot of the United States, most people have never been on a train, and that includes our legislators. There's this whole side of just helping people realize that there's economic benefits and there's genuine benefits to entire groups of people that we're not serving right now.
Education might sound like an easy first step, especially if you spend too much time on transit YouTube already. But the next step is actually pretty hard, and that step is to do one more thing.
Our social media's goal is to get you to do one more thing, whether that is a call to action to fill out a survey for the transportation department, or to go to our website and just read an article and inform yourself. From there, you can keep going, where donations, of course, and then events. We're hosting chapter meetings all across Ohio, and those are ultimately going to be your pipeline to volunteers that go and do stuff.
This is all about spreading education to others, including upwards, to educate your political representatives.
That is a huge part of this, like going and talking with government officials, making an appointment, sitting down, chatting for an hour. Their job is to represent people, and they're not going to be able to represent those people well if you don't also teach them.
There's no guarantee that this works, of course, but there's also no reason why it won't.
Who led the charge at the national level for restoring service on the Gulf? Senator Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi. Why? Because he heard from those elected mayors along the Gulf in Mississippi, and he heard from the citizens. We convinced everyone to do let's have an inspection train, run a train from New Orleans to Mobile and inspect the track. Well, of course, what that became was a show of great support from every city that train came to. The whole line was filled with people who were there to cheer the possibility of having passenger rail again after having lost it. And Senator Wicker was moved by that. He was convinced by that because they were listening to the people from the local level, businesses, seniors, those with disabilities. When you look at the Gulf service, which is tripling estimates, revenue pouring in, mayors all of a sudden say, I like that. That's economic development. That can get me reelected. Success breeds success. And if you can get your congressman or your senator to stop long enough and listen, you can change minds.